This is Dr. James Sandy here interviewing Joseph Carpenter for the Mavs Veteran Voices Project. It is July 8th, 2022. We are here at University Hall on the University of Texas at Arlington's campus, and this interview and this project is sponsored by the College of Liberal Arts. Hey, Joe.
Hey.
How's it going?
Good.
So, we're just going to roll right into this, yeah.
Yeah.
So, first off, where are you from originally? What can you tell me about growing up?
Well, I was born at Baylor Hospital in Dallas, Texas, and I was raised in Garland, Texas, all my life.
Local boy.
Definitely. One of the few.
What was your childhood like?
It was good. It was good. It was, fairly middle class, lived in a middle class neighborhood, good schools. It was good.
Yeah. What about your family? Parents?
Uh-huh.
Siblings?
I have my parents still living, and I have an older brother and a younger sister. My older brother is 3 years older than me, and my sister is 6 years younger than me. And my dad was a computer science guy before it was cool to be a computer science guy. So 1960s is when he got into computers and stayed in it up to about the age of 80.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Forward-facing house? Technologically wise?
Sure. I guess so. I wasn't very technologically savvy, but my brother picked it up.
What were you interested in as a kid?
History.
Why?
That's all.
Why?
I read a biography when I was probably in second grade, and it was the biography of John F. Kennedy, specifically during his time in the Pacific during World War II. It just fascinated me, and I can't say specifically why, but it just engrossed me, and from then on, I was just snagged, I guess.
Hooked.
Yeah.
So in Garland, where'd you go to high school?
South Garland High School.
Okay. What was that like?
High school is high school, and this is it's kind of an interesting thing. So I'm going to surprise you in the process of this. So went to high school. I wasn't very good in school. That may not be the part that's surprising, but come my senior year, I was one credit short of graduating. And so I was going to go to summer school, got in a car accident right before my first summer school class, so I didn't go, and I quit school. And when I was, I guess I just turned 18, dropped out of high school, went to work, and did that for about a year before I joined the Air Force.
Wow, okay. So at what point did you then go back? I don't want to get ahead, but...
Yeah, no, that's fine. Well, I got my GED before I went into the Air Force, and the Air Force had just opened up the enlistments for people with GEDs. And so, the day that I decided to go to the recruiter, it was almost that kind of timing. The day that I went to the recruiter was the day they opened it up. And the day I signed on the dotted line practically was the day they closed it down. Yeah, exactly. It's like running for the back of the train, right?
Yeah. So when you were in high school, you had this interest in history, right? But
yes.
What's your connection with military service?
Well, if I could go back to high school for just a second, I had a history teacher in high school, Dr. Denzel Clifton. And he was not the most popular history teacher in the school, but he was, to me, he was great. And he was hard. That was the bottom line. He was hard, and that's why people didn't like him, because he was a tough teacher. And but I had an A in history when I left school. And he kind of shook his head and wished me the best, and that was that. And so, like I said, I went back, got my GED, went in the Air Force. My father was in the Air National Guard sometime in the early 60s. My grandfathers on both sides served in World War II. My great-grandfather served in World War I, the Spanish-American War, and I have one great-grandfather who's buried at Arlington.
Wow, so your family is a pretty extensive military.
Yes, very much so, very much so. I always had kind of a connection to it. I was always kind of a Civil War buff and World War II, like most people.
Is that how did you bond with your father and grandfathers and people over that?
Not over that so much. I was like every other kid, I didn't ask a lot of questions, didn't really understand what their experience had been, what they'd been through. I just saw pictures of them in uniform, and I thought that was really cool. And so I think that's more what it was. But as far as bonding with them over their military service, not so much. I have an uncle who was in the Air Force at the same time I was, who was enlisted, and I called him one day in basic training because I was about to cry, because the drill instructor at that time, they were kind of in between this thing where they could touch you really and they couldn't touch you, and so the drill instructor was in my face with his Smokey Bear hat on and yelling at me, and as he's yelling at me, he's tipping his head like this, and it's knocking me in the forehead every time he does it. And so I was humiliated, and so I was just ready to take off. Just say, forget this. And I called my uncle, and my uncle said, it's just a game, play the game. It's all it is. They're playing by their rules, you play by the rules, you'll be fine. And I took that advice and stayed in, and went on to get my high school diploma, by the way, while I was in the Air Force, from Cooper High School in Abilene, Texas. Yep.
West Texas. While you were in high school, did you have any thoughts, plans about joining the military? Any interest in ROTC or anything like that?
No. I had, flirted with the idea of going in the military. A friend of mine and I talked about going in, at the same time they would let you go in and go in with a buddy at that time. And we talked about doing it, and he went in and I didn't. So I waited a little while longer until I realized that it was kind of like a revelation, I guess. So one day I woke up and said, I'm not going anywhere, career-wise or anything else, and this is what I need to do. And I just went and did it. I didn't talk to my parents. I didn't talk to anybody. I just went to the recruiter and said, here's what I want to do. He said, okay. And that's how I got there.
Signed up that day?
Close to it, yeah. I mean, he scheduled me for going to MEPS and taking the ASVAB, the entry test, and but I mean, there was no doubt that I was going in after that.
Why the Air Force?
I have to be real careful about what I say about the Army, because my friends, I've got a lot of friends in the Army, as you know, and Army just didn't seem like my thing. Marine Corps would have kicked my ass. The Navy, I thought about the Navy, but I figured that I was going to get married. Had been dating somebody for a long time and thought that I was going to get married, and Navy life didn't seem like the ideal environment for that, so landed on the Air Force.
Gotcha. What year did you enlist?
1984.
1984. What was the Air Force like in 1984?
For me, it's interesting because I was a medic, and I went in and I'll back up a little bit. I had three choices after I took the ASVAB. I had three choices, and I chose being an air traffic controller, security police, which is law enforcement, or being a medic. And fortunately for me, they chose the medical corps. And the reason why it's fortunate is because the medical corps is much more casual, much more relaxed than maybe the rest of the Air Force. And so, as you know, I'm kind of casual myself, and so there you have it. But what it was like, it was, we were between wars. There were little conflicts going on, during that time, but little conflicts to me because I wasn't engaged in them. But it was good. It was a good environment, good people. I met a lot of wonderful people, good friends, people I stay in contact with today. So it was really good, and it was not real uptight,
Sure.
So it's good.
So, kind of walk us through kind of where did you end up going for your basic services and
Okay.
your advanced training and
Okay. Well, basic training for the Air Force, at least at that time, I assume it's still this way, was Lackland Air Force Base in San Antonio. So I go from Dallas to San Antonio. And 6 weeks, I think of 6 weeks of basic training. This was it was December when I went in, and they had a white Christmas that year in San Antonio. It snowed and the base was basically shut down. It was very strange, also very cold. And then after basic training, I went to Shepherd Air Force Base in Wichita Falls, Texas, again. And that was, I don't remember, 2 months, something like that, 2 or 3 months, and 12 weeks, maybe 12 weeks. And that was great. That's where I met really people who became my close friends throughout my career. Was in tech school, and a couple of us ended up at the same base at the end of training. And but it was, again, it was very, it was not particularly stringent. It was more academically stringent than it was physically, which is, again, is good for me because, I'm in great shape and all that. Always have loved exercise. If there's a hell for me, it's got exercise in it, I can tell you. And then my first and only duty station for a little over 8 years was Dyess Air Force Base in Abilene, Texas. So, as we used to laughingly say, join the Air Force, see the world, stay in Texas.
So I want to get to that. But
yeah.
Coming back to you choosing / being,
Mm-hmm.
selected for being a medic.
Yeah.
That's kind of a specific
Mm-hmm.
direction. Did
Mm-hmm.
you have any interest in that coming out of high school?
My mom was going to nursing school at the time, and so I had some vague interest in it. As it turned out, what my strength was, I worked with a lot of great people, a lot of great medics, but as it turned out for me, what my strength was the psychological aspect. We had suicide gestures, we had drug overdoses, we took care of families at the time as well. And so in the Air Force Hospital, we took care of military dependents. And so I had some opportunity to explore that side. And it got to the point where the mental health folks, the social workers and the psychologists and psychiatrists would call me before they came in. If they were called on something, they would call me and say, tell me what you think, tell me what's going on. And And I really liked that. Everybody else was into trauma and, and all of that stuff. That stuff didn't interest me, but the psychological aspect did. So it was accidental in a way, although there was that connection with my mom. It was accidental in a way, but it was a fortuitous accident.
Yeah, and do you feel that is an abnormal kind of direction for an Air Force medic to be involved in? Is that something that you were prepared for during your training?
No, not really. It was something that I think came about. I think came about in part probably because my own struggles as as an adolescent, and I had a certain level of sympathy or empathy for folks who struggled with some sort of mental health issue. But after training, I became an emergency medical technician and all of that, and so I had to know, and I had to be good at those other things, the trauma or the cardiac arrests or whatever, and I was okay at that. But that was my strength, and it was really just kind of more of a natural progression as opposed to anything that was brought about by training.
Was that something that the Air Force cared about in any official capacity in the 1980s?
Only the people in the mental health side of it, and I had an interesting event related to that. I was working a night shift on a medical surgical floor, and we had retirees, we had retirees' family members, we had active duty folks, active duty family members, and we had one young lady come in, and or she was admitted, and she'd just had a baby, and she had been diagnosed with epilepsy, and she was distraught about being taken away from her baby and admitted to the hospital, and we had to put her in a specific room, and one of the nurses, not really thinking clearly, let her go to the bathroom by herself. And she came out, this nurse came out of the room and said, she's out on the ledge. And we were, it was 3 stories up, but it was really about 4. And there was a ledge about 6 feet down from the window, and she was walking along that ledge, and automatically I jumped out after her, and we sat there and talked, and she told me her story, and that her mom wouldn't let her hold her baby because her mom was afraid that she would have a seizure while she was holding the baby, and she was just torn up about it, and she wanted to die. And this is interesting, and I'm glad I can't remember the psychiatrist's name at the time, but it was one that I didn't get along with. He was yelling out the window from up above us, "What kind of mother are you? Think about what you're doing to your baby." And I'm sitting there going, don't listen to that. let's just be calm. Let's just sit here and talk. Well, the cool thing about it was we got they got a cherry picker or whatever and came up and got us and all that. And the base commander came and pinned a medal on me, and that was pretty cool. And I don't know, that there was a good lesson in that because it showed me that I would respond in a time of crisis, that I wouldn't freeze, that I'd respond. And so that made me more confident as a medic that, in an emergency I'm ready to go and not going to, step back and go, oh my gosh, what am I doing?
It's an incredible story.
Thanks.
Yeah. What was the medal? And how did that all happen?
It was an Air Force Achievement Medal, which is not very highly coveted, but it was mine. And the reason why I suspect that I got it was that the base commander wanted to make an immediate presentation, and that's what he was authorized to do. That was the level at which he was authorized to do it, and that's why he did it. So, could have been a higher medal. That would have been great, but whatever.
That's an incredible story.
Thanks.
Sounds like you learned a lot about yourself in that moment.
I did. In that one moment, I learned a lot about myself. Changed my level of confidence like you wouldn't believe.
How early was that in your career?
Very early. Within probably the first year and a half or so that I was in.
Wow.
So it's very early.
Where does that rank in terms of the kind of crises, emergency moments you faced
While
you're in Abilene, at least?
Right. I had some others. For me, that was the most important moment of maybe my Air Force career, was that. But as far as severity of crisis, it was on up there, in the top 2 or 3. But we had pilots. They had pilot training there, and the T-38 was the jet trainer, and they notoriously had a rather, I don't know if you'd call it brittle canopy. And so we had a couple of incidences where a bird, like a buzzard, would come through the canopy on a T-38 in flight, and in one case it resulted in somebody dying. The other case, it resulted in a guy his face was just. And so, we had things like that. We had family members that died. We had children in the hospital, babies that died, and or had severe problems. So if you're asking from a personal standpoint, obviously that incident that resulted in the medal was the most significant. But there were other crises that I remember specifically and that stand out in my mind.
So I want to talk about your deployment. Right?
Yeah.
And anything else from your time at DIAS? Because you said you were there for 8 years.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Anything else stand out?
I was working in the medical surgical floor. That I enjoyed, and it all kind of relates back to the other stuff in that I got an opportunity to really get to know people, and again, retirees. We had Vietnam veterans. Many of them struggled from the results of alcoholism, that sort of thing. And so I got to know people, and elderly people in some cases, where I had the time to talk, and get to know them. Take it back to the biography when I was 7 years old. I've always been interested in what makes people tick. And so then about about 1986, I want to say, I was moved to the emergency room and spent 5.5 years in the emergency room. That wasn't really my thing. That was the natural progression for a medic in a small hospital, and but it wasn't really my thing. As I said, all my friends were like, "Yeah, trauma." It was cool driving an ambulance. That was cool. Lights and sirens and people getting out of your way, stuff like that. That was cool. But I didn't enjoy that very much. And what I did enjoy was, after that, I went to work in flight medicine in physical exams, and I was responsible for evaluating people's fitness to remain in the service. So I'd review medical records and take them to the doctor and say, hey, here, we've got this, there's this problem and that problem. I really enjoyed that because it revealed a new part of me or a new side of me that I didn't know that I had, and it was this organizational ability and this administrative ability. But part of that job, working in flight medicine, was then I was attached as a medic to the 772nd Airlift Squadron, which was a C-130 squadron. There were two C-130 squadrons on the base, the 72nd and the 73rd, and I was one of two medics attached to the 72nd, which is how I ended up in my brief stint in Saudi Arabia.
So that, just real quick, is that a pretty direct linear progression from medic to EMT up to a position in a squadron like that?
I would not say, no. I think it was unusual. It wasn't because I was this a glorious service member that I was given this honor. Not so much. I had good relationships with the flight surgeons, and when I was finally absolutely had enough in the emergency room, that position came open, and I went and begged a few people, give me a shot at that, and that's what happened. So normally what would happen is you would you'd go from the emergency room to being the non-commissioned officer in charge of one of the clinics, the not physical therapy, but you could go to pediatrics, or you could go to the internal medicine clinic or what have you, and that just never panned out, and so that's where I ended up, was in flight medicine.
Okay, so attached to this squad, you got your deployment experience.
Yeah.
Right? So tell us about that, when that was, where'd you go?
Okay, it was June 1992, so the ground war was over. We were still actively engaged in the cleanup effort, particularly in Kuwait, and so my squadron was flying in and out of Kuwait. We were in Dhahran, Saudi Arabia, which is something of a, or at least was something of a resort town in Saudi Arabia. It was very westernized as compared to other areas of the country. It was an arduous experience in that I had a Baskin-Robbins within walking distance. It was terrible. I love ice cream, still love ice cream. And so that was great. Every day we went to Baskin-Robbins. I spent a lot of time at the gym, spent a lot of time at the pool, and a little time working. And my job was to take care of my squadron and the guys in my squadron. And the funny thing was, we stayed in Khobar Towers. That's where we resided, and that was 3 years prior to Khobar Towers being blown up. But at that time, we didn't have any sense of danger. It was really strange how naive we were, I think. But nonetheless, I'll give you an example of my naivete, and that is, we had access to vehicles pretty regularly. So, I could go to the squadron administration and say, hey, I want to take that Land Cruiser and go wherever. Oh, okay, there you go, here's the keys, and so we'd go to downtown Dhahran, we'd go out in the desert, we would do all that. Well, one time we were driving, and the base, the Air Force Base is attached to a civilian Air Force Base, and I get confused as to whether it's King Fahd Air Base or King Abdul Aziz Air Base, but nonetheless, it was attached to the international airport there. And there's a road that runs between the two. And we were driving down the road, and me and a couple of friends, and I was snapping pictures of the Patriot missile batteries because I thought, seeing these on TV, these are so cool. Look, the police pull us over, and they come to me and they say, what the hell are you doing? It's the Patriot missile batteries. They're so cool, They say, you can't do that. So I was clueless, you know. I didn't think espionage or anything like that. I was just taking pictures of a cool weapon, you know. And so that was one experience. Another was a very close friend of mine was the crew chief on a C-130, or a flight engineer, excuse me, flight engineer. And he was readying his plane for a mission the next day. And he said, "Hey, you want to go out and we can go out and get the plane ready real quick, and then we'll just hang out after that." And I'm like, "Okay, cool." So I went out with him, and they ended up having a problem. And he said, "Well, you might as well just go back because I'm going to be here a while." Well, I hadn't been paying attention to where I was going, so how to get back. I just kind of had a general sense of direction, and I ended up on the civilian side of the airport with Saudi security, Saudi Army, I assume Army, aiming their weapons at me, going, "What the hell are you doing?" I'm just a stupid medic. I don't know. But that was an adventure. They let me go, obviously, and pointed me in the right direction, and that was that. But in Cobar Towers, when I arrived, backing up a little bit, I was the doc. That's what they call me. It's the doc. And so the doc gets his own bedroom, and in the way it worked is they have like a center area and like a day room kind of area, and then spoked off from the day room are sleeping quarters, if you will. Mine had a bathroom, so I had my own room by myself, my own bathroom. I had a bidet. I didn't know what the hell a bidet was. I knew I wasn't supposed to drink out of it. I did know that. I'd seen Crocodile Dundee, so I had some kind of idea of what what the bidet was for. Other than that, it was cool. It was. I wasn't there very long. I was only there 6 weeks. Nothing. The most serious thing happened was a guy blew his Achilles tendon out playing basketball, and we had to go pick him up, and that was pretty awful. And then we had another guy who ended up with I don't know how you diagnose it, but a leak of his cerebral spinal fluid from lifting weights. He had strained so hard that he'd had a leak of cerebral spinal fluid. It went into his head, and I'd never seen anybody in such excruciating pain in all my life. It was just incredible. So we had to, get him set to go out real fast. But no battle casualties, anything like that. And I wasn't there to do that. I was there to hand out Sudafed and Tylenol for the flight crews, and whatever else came up just happened to come up. But one interesting thing was I talked about my friends in tech school in Wichita Falls. Well, one of the guys in tech school, I'll give him a shout out. His name's Dave Nordell, and Dave and I were the very best of friends in tech school. We were inseparable, and he and I had the same sense of humor. We drove the instructors nuts because we had this sense of humor. It was silly. We weren't in high school, but they still had to separate us because we were always, cracking jokes and stuff like that. I can't tell you what they were, but they were funny. So I hadn't seen Dave in 8 years. I'd talked to him like once or twice on the phone. He'd gone to California when I ended up in Abilene. And so I'm sitting and working in this clinic, and this clinic working was about 25% of the time that I was there. I was in this clinic. I mean, so what are the odds, right? Well, in walks this guy, and it's Dave Nordell. I haven't seen him in 8 years, and it was just like, it was so bizarre. And he was working in a foxhole in outside of Riyadh. he was out in the desert. He was doing it. But he retired in E9, a chief master sergeant, so he got paid back. But nonetheless, it was just a cool experience. It was kind of one of those, oh, it's such a small world thing. You hear that all the time, and it really is. It's a cool experience.
Chance encounter.
Yeah, very much so. Had no idea he was there. He had no idea I was there. It was just like, it was very cool.
Cool. So 6 weeks. Not that.
Yeah, 6 weeks. Not that long. I split a rotation with another medic. Our squadron would rotate in for 3 months and rotate out, and then the 73rd would rotate in for 3 months and rotate out. And for me, I split it with another medic, and so just 6 weeks. But that made me a Desert Storm veteran, and I could wear the hat and all that stuff. But got my Southwest Asia Service Medal and all. But it wasn't, it wasn't all that.
Well, it sounds like when you were there, you were pretty insular in terms of the people you were around. You spent 6 weeks on the base.
No, we went downtown. I had a flight surgeon who worked with me, and another shout out, Dr. Billy Ligon, great guy. He's in Dripping Springs, Texas. Is where he's from, and just a wonderful guy. And I ran into him at a conference when I was in medical device sales in Florida. Yeah, it was weird, but nonetheless, we'd go downtown and shop. Gold was dirt cheap in Saudi Arabia, so you could buy nice gold things, and for your loved ones, and which I did. And I remember one specific incident where we were walking down the street, just checking out everything, and there was a store that sold rugs, and very nice rugs. And the proprietor of the store, who was a Saudi, invited us in and sat us down, and we had tea with him and just talked, and it was cool. It was my first experience outside the country, really, other than Jamaica for my honeymoon. It was my first experience, and I loved the culture, and I loved what it taught me was at first that people are people, but second that how hospitable the Arabs were, Saudi Arabians were in particular, but I think it's true of Middle Easterners in general, is that they're very hospitable, and that's part of their culture, and I really appreciated that, and it was a wonderful experience.
How much prep work culturally, language-wise, did the Air Force provide before you got there, if any?
A little. There was some, because by this time, by the war is over. Our being there, it maybe in some circles wasn't felt to be as necessary as it had been, and so there were some sensitivities there, and so. For instance, you don't bring booze into Saudi Arabia. You just don't. And so I remember when we arrived, somebody had tried to bring in a case of beer or whatever, and because we flew over on our own aircraft, and which is a long, arduous journey across the ocean, and a stop in England, and a stop in Germany, and a stop in Sicily, and before we went on, and but one person apparently had tried to bring a case of beer or something into Saudi Arabia, and you claim when you get there, they lay out everything, all your personal belongings, they lay them out, and you go through and you pick you get your stuff, and well, there's this one box. Nobody's claiming it. And nobody would claim it. And the reason why nobody would claim it is whoever decided to bring the case of beer in chickened out. And There's this case of beer. So there's no alcohol was brought in, no pornography, so we had to learn about things like that. We had to learn about, prayer time and all of that. And that was really interesting. The call to prayer was, it was interesting hearing that. It's moving, and to be downtown when people stop and pray is very interesting because people just, in the middle of downtown are, on their face, and it was interesting, very interesting.
It's a long way away from Texas. Yeah.
Long way away from Texas, and I'd not spent a lot of time with people from Saudi Arabia. My grandparents had spent 8 years in Saudi Arabia working for. My grandfather worked for General Electric, and when we sold F-15s or F-16s, I forget which, to the Saudi Air Force, he went over there and worked with the Saudis to learn how to work on those things. But that was the only awareness that I had of Saudi Arabia at all. There is one thing that I always tell people, and that is, how they show, like when you look on TV and you think of Saudi Arabia, you think of the Middle East, you think of desert, and you think of everything as being brown and all that stuff. Well, yeah, that's what it's like. That's a good portrayal. Lots of sand. Lots of sand. Yeah, they did, and it was hot. And that's the other thing. I failed to mention this too. One of the wonderful things. This is to my Army buddies. One of the wonderful things that I experienced was, as I'm in my air-conditioned single room with the bathroom and the bidet, I have a window, and in my window, I can open up my window and I can look out and I could see this vast ocean of green canvas, which were the tents that the Army had to stay in the 118-degree heat. And I said, this is why I joined the Air Force.
Good decision.
Yeah, good call.
So you mentioned, I haven't asked you this yet, but you mentioned your loved ones, right? Were you married in a relationship?
I was.
Yeah.
I was. I was married and had 3 kids.
When did you get married?
1985. So just right after I went to the Air Force. Yeah. Okay. My wife and I dated 3.5 years before I went in, and so we got married in 85.
And you mentioned that was part of the calculus for joining the Air Force.
Yeah, is that we were, I suspected that we were going to be married, and so that was part of it.
Yeah. What was that like being raising a family as you were serving?
That was the hardest part. I was very engaged in the lives of my kids. I adored I had 3 little girls, and I adored them, and so it was hard for me to leave them. I think that was the most difficult part for me, was being away from my kids. And it's just a short time. You think about nowadays, these deployments last a year. And in the Air Force, they had certain assignments that were remote assignments that people would be gone for a year. But I'd never experienced it, and it was hard, and wasn't a lot of communication. I couldn't talk to them on the phone all the time or whatever. We had to have remember calling cards, the long distance calling cards, and then the operator would get on the phone, and about 5 minutes into it, your time is up, and it's like, so it was difficult, especially, my wife and kids got sick when I was gone, and that made it difficult. But I had a lot of church friends and others who kind of watched out for them. And
how old were your kids when you went on your deployment?
Well, I was there in 92, so the youngest would have been less than a year old, and then 2, and then 4.
Wow,
yeah. So they were very young, and so that was, and then hearing, my wife made videos of the time, and the kids would be, particularly my second daughter. My wife would say, she'd look in the camera and smile at you. I don't want to smile, that kind of thing, and say hi to Daddy. He's not in there, that kind of thing. It's really cute. And that was just heartbreaking. It's supposed to be, but for me, it was just like, oh my gosh, it was torture being away from them. But,
long 6 weeks.
Yeah, it was a very long 6 weeks. But, again, it was only 6 weeks. And so it's not like, what other people have had to do.
Yeah. So for the majority of your Air Force career, obviously you got to be home at dinner, or maybe not home for dinner.
Yeah. Yeah, pretty much. We, other than exercises and, going out in the field for exercises and that sort of thing, it was almost like a regular job. Yeah, and so it was, lived in base housing a large portion of that time, and it was a very insulated environment, but it was like a regular job. Yeah.
So, as you come back from your deployment, right, what does your career look like in the Air Force in terms of, are you thinking you want to try and make a career out of it? What are your prospects after your deployment?
That's that is a good question. I'd bounced around back and forth about whether I wanted to make it a career or not. Ultimately, my wife didn't want to live overseas, which was my next step. You're not 8 years or 7 years at an Air Force base for without ever getting an overseas deployment and hey, 20 years, here I am, I'm ready to retire, So I'd considered it. After the first enlistment, I was ready to get out, but things didn't pan out, and so I re-enlisted. After the second enlistment, I was ready to get out, and things weren't panning out again, so I was going to re-enlist again. So that's after my 8th year. And then a friend of mine knew of this medical device. I actually worked for a medical device company, and he put me on to this job opening that they had, and I was able to switch my active duty time to reserve time and go to work for that medical device company. And so I got out in 1993 after a little over 8 years, and went to work for a medical device company and spent the next 17 years with that company.
Gosh, so you said you transferred to the reserves, right? Did you stay in as a reservist?
I stayed in as a reservist, and I did one reserve assignment, and then I went on inactive reserves, which they allowed me to do. If it interferes with your job, then you can go to them and say, can you put me on inactive reserves, at least at that time. And so I was on inactive reserves until 1997.
Oh, okay. Running out of time, right? Too many questions. What rank did you when you left?
I was a staff sergeant, E5.
Okay. Okay, so then you do the medical device sales, 17 years.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Started out as a delivery driver, cleaning dirty medical equipment and delivering medical equipment, picking it up, that sort of thing. And then I worked my way up to be the operations manager. So I moved to Dallas from Abilene, moved back home, and got a job as a operations manager for the company. Had about 10 guys working for me, delivery guys and all that. Did that for about a year, and then was promoted into kind of a hybrid sales position, and ultimately was promoted into a sales position that was a real sales position. It was degree required, even though I didn't have a degree, and just one of those rare things where you're allowed to work your way up in a company. And so I did that from 98 to 2010. Was in full sales, role.
Got your kids through high school, started off?
Yeah,
Early lives?
yeah, I got them going in high school. I had two more kids after that, so I had five total at that time, and five girls. And uh, so I did that for, like I said, 17 years, and um, some things happened. I ended up getting a divorce, which was very difficult. Created a lot of problems for me job performance wise. I ended up getting fired. Fortunately for me, they did a really bad job of firing me, so they had to pay me a big severance.
That always
And
helps.
yeah, it was nice. I took a year off, didn't do a thing. Well, I did. I recorded music. That's what I did. I had all these
Yeah. Did something for
song ideas in my head, and so and bought a BMW and
all the things you're supposed to do, right?
right.
During that time after you leave the Air Force, right?
Yeah.
What is your status as a veteran? Kind of how does that impact your life if it does?
Very little. It was acknowledged every now and then. Had a good friend with the medical device company that always drew attention to the fact that I was a veteran, and still friends with him today as well. But not a lot. The fact that I'd been a medic and going into the medical field and medical device field, I had some understanding, maybe ahead of some other people, of the medical field and how to communicate with doctors and that sort of thing, because I had to do that
Sure.
while I was in the Air Force. So, yeah.
So then, bringing it around full circle, right? After you leave the medical device field, right? You mentioned you didn't have a degree,
Right.
right? And so, how do you end up back at UTA?
Well, I had sometime in the late 90s, early 2000s, I started going back to school, and I was going to get a degree in hospital administration because that seemed like medical devices, that seemed logical. And so I got probably 105 hours towards a degree in hospital administration, as I said. And then life started taking over, and I never finished. Ran out of money, and then the divorce happened, and all that stuff. And so I was kind of on my own I went into insurance, sold insurance for a total of 5 years after when I finally went back to work. In medical devices, when you're out, you're out. You lose your contacts, all the relationships you had, they don't want you back. And so I went to work for one insurance company, and for 2 years it was a miserable experience. And I won't mention the name of the company, but it's three of the same letter. And I had the worst boss I'd ever had in my entire life. I was miserable. And, I'd also had my own emotional struggles from, the divorce and the aftermath of that, and getting, let go from a job of 17 years. And so I didn't finish college, quit that job, and I went to work at Guitar Center because I'm a fairly poor musician, but a musician nonetheless. And I found a job at Guitar Center. And at the same time, an insurance agent at Farmers contacted me, and she was wanting to retire, and she wanted somebody to take over her agency for her. And so I went to work for her as what's called an agency producer, and that basically just means that I make a lot of phone calls and try to sell policies. And so during that time, I had decided that I wanted to get remarried, and that was it. But I wanted to find the right person, and so a little plug for eharmony.com, because that's where that's how I met my current wife. We met in 2013. She had adopted 3 kids before we got married, and so she was rather a saintly person, and kind of a Mother Teresa type in some ways. And I met her, and through the process of us dating, she said, you know, you're miserable selling insurance. You hate doing that. And I said, well, yes, I do. And she said, if you could do anything at all, what would it be? And I said, I would go back to school and get my PhD in history. And she said, well, I think you should do that. And I said, I'm going to be 60-something years old by the time I finish a PhD. And she said, you know, how old are you going to be if you don't? And it just irritated me because she was so right. And I didn't like that. But it was so true. You know, it's like, duh. You know, why did I think of that? And so she encouraged me, and she was working as an executive assistant for John Peter Smith Hospital for the CIO at John Peter Smith, but she'd had a master's degree in counseling, and she had to get, I think it was at that time 3,000 hours of 3,000 internship hours in order to get her license, and she hadn't done it, and it'd been almost 10 years. And so she said, well, how am I supposed to do that? You know, because I told her, you need to go back, get your license. And I can't do that. I have 3 kids, blah, blah. Well, we're going to make it happen. And so we worked together. I worked my 2 jobs at Guitar Center and Farmers Insurance. And she asked her boss if she could work for 4 days a week so she could go do her internship hours, and her boss was agreeable to that. And so she finished her internship hours, and then I started to school. And so that's how I ended up at UTA. Now, she lived in Arlington before we were married. This was home. She had other family members here, and so I moved here, and here I am.
So what we were talking about, right? So you're coming back to UTA, and you end up wanting to get your PhD in history. So where do you start?
With Nancy Gandry.
Okay.
I kind of showed up. Nancy was the history history department advisor. As I remember it, she worked through the issues with my past credits and how many credits can we fit into what, where, and how does it all, using as many credits as I possibly can use from my previous college experience. And she began to just direct me to, okay, here's what you need to do. You need to go to Veterans Affairs. You need to, get your Hazelwood stuff in order so they can pay for your classes, because I had not used Hazelwood the prior 105 hours. And so I had 156 hours to use. And so it was really just, she doesn't, when I talk to her about it, she almost acts surprised that I place so much value in what she did for me. But she guided me every step of the way there in the beginning. I don't know if I would have been able to accomplish what I accomplished without her guidance throughout the beginning of that process, maybe even into the first 2 or 3 years.
What was it? What did you feel coming back to college after 20 years almost, or 15 years?
Yeah, something like that. It was pretty interesting because I was suffering from narcolepsy at the time, and so I would sit through a class, and I'd be sitting through some of these classes, and I could not stay awake for the life of me. And finally, my wife is, you need to go get a sleep study done and blah, blah, blah. Well, as it turns out, I have sleep apnea, worse than anybody should have it. And so they fixed that problem. And then after that, it was like, with the exception of the classes that I really didn't care about. I mean, obviously there are classes that you have to take that you're just like, you know, no offense to my Texas political science friends, but Texas government is boring with a capital B, for instance. But other than that, doing the history classes, and really as I got to the place where I was able to do real history classes and just consistent history classes, it was like a hobby. It was odd. It was not like work. It was not like, oh gosh, I've got to write another paper. You know, it wasn't like that. It was just fun, and it has been for, you know, through the finishing my bachelor's degree into, you know, finishing my master's degree. It's just been fun.
It was something you felt you should be doing.
Yeah, called to in a way, and I think that that's true, and I think whatever success that I've had has been borne out in that.
Sure. So, how do you describe your time at UTA as a bachelor's student, as an undergraduate?
You know, being a non-traditional student, or as the new university president refers to it, as a post-traditional student, which I was a little surprised by. I'm not sure I like that, but nonetheless, being a post-traditional student, it was interesting because very few people, and not aiming this at anybody in particular, very few people took interest in what I wanted to do. You know, here I'm, you know, the middle-aged guy coming in here and getting a degree in history, and it's probably a hobby, you know, or it's you know, he's just doing this just because or whatever, I guess. But nobody ever asked me, where do you want to go? You know, where is this taking you? What are your plans for the future? And at first, you know, in the beginning, before I met you, the only other person who'd taken any significant interest in me was Dr. Honeycutt. And that's because he got his PhD when he was older. And so he was sympathetic to that, you know, to what my experience was and that sort of thing. But once again, Nancy, I'd asked her a question about internships. And she said, you need to talk to Dr. Sandy. Oh, okay. Well, then this whole thing, and I forget the order of it, but this whole thing about getting a minor. I had a history major. What was my minor going to be? I had to have a minor. And I was like, well, I guess I could do business. You know, I've got 105 hours in business, so that's logical. I'll just do a minor in business. So Nancy says, well, go to the business department and see what it's going to take. Well, they wanted me to take 12 hours of business courses. No, I'm not going to do that. I don't want to I'm done with that. That's another lifetime. And so I came back and I'm like, you know, Nancy, this is really frustrating. Well, it just so happens that we open up this military history minor. And some of these classes will count towards your major and your minor at the same time. And I went, no way. And she said, you need to go take Dr. Sandy's class. And I went, I heard that name before. And so I ended up in your military history class. And so in answer to your question, that's a long-winded answer as usual, but in answer to your question, what it was like was I didn't feel particularly valued except for Nancy, for Dr. Honeycutt, and then for you. That's the way it was, because I was, again, a post-traditional student. So it wasn't hard, it was disappointing. Sure. But, you know, after, you know, I met you, and then the story after that. There's probably questions after that.
So I want to ask you about Steve, right?
Yeah, yeah.
It's a long story.
It is a long story,
so
like everything I say.
You have this really fantastic moment with your father-in-law.
Yes,
right?
yes, yes.
Tell us a bit about that and
Sure.
what that means to you as you're about to graduate from UTA with your degree in history.
Yeah, that kind of turned everything around emotionally, I think, because first of all, I took the military history class with you, and your assignment was the unpaper, and when I went and asked you, can I do this interview with my father-in-law? He was a helicopter pilot in Vietnam. I knew very little about what he did. I knew he was a helicopter pilot in Vietnam, and we'd talked some about it, but I didn't really have an understanding fully of what his experience was. And so I interviewed him, and part of that process in interviewing him, and I have to say this just because it's funny, is he talks loud. And it's because he's, without his hearing aids, he's very hard of hearing. And the VA asked him if it was service related. And he said, I flew helicopters in Vietnam. And they said, oh, here's your hearing aids. And so I interviewed him for 8 hours and interviewed my mother-in-law as well. And I got home and my wife says, well, how'd it go? And I said, my ears are tired. Because I love Steve, but boy, he talks loud. And so, but anyway, so in this process of interviewing him, he says, one of my greatest regrets in life is that I never finished my degree. And he had attended Arlington State College. He was 9 hours from graduating. He had been a full-time ROTC student, Sam Houston Rifles, and the whole bit. Very proud of that. And he met my mother-in-law, and that became his focus rather than school. And so he went part-time in school, and when he did that, the professor of military science, I believe, went to him and said, I understand you're not a full-time student anymore. And he says, no, sir, I'm not. And he said, well, enlist or take your commission. And he was 9 hours short. So he took his commission and he ended up in Vietnam. And he never finished, never went back. 9 hours of foreign language, I think, is what he lacked. And yes, foreign language, the bane of us all. And and so this thing that he told me, it just stuck in my head, and I'm like, I wonder what we could do about that, because let's be honest, Steve and Wilma, his wife, are saintly people. My wife, who is not related to them in any way, but is roommates with Steve and Wilma's daughter, because they're both single women in their 40s. When my wife adopted our 3 kids, because the state had taken them away from a family member, Steve and Wilma were right there, like grandparents. And yeah, boy, you get me going like Barbara Walters here in a minute. But they were there. And I remember one time in particular, we were having a struggle with one of our kids, and I was talking to Steve about it, and Steve said, well, we'll do what we have to do. We'll make this work. And I'm like, well, I'm not going to ask you to do that. And he said, Joe, that's what family does. And I'm like, oh, wow. I mean, it just blew me away, because they're not blood relatives. My wife's been friends with their daughter for, 25, 30 years now. But they weren't blood related. My wife's parents were deceased, and that's all she knew. And so this good person mentions this, this one regret. And I'm like, how can I address this? How can I do something about this? And that's when I contacted you about it, and you ran it up the flagpole, and everybody who got a hold of it did their part. And from you to Dr. Palmer to Dr. Bosterly and Dr. Cawthon. Yes, thank you. I can't forget her because she was so critical in all this. And anyway, that totally turned my perspective about my undergrad experience. I didn't hate it because I had Nancy Gandry, then I had Dr. Honeycutt, then I had you. So I wasn't angry about anything. I was just disappointed. But when that came about, it gave me a whole new perspective on how UTA really cares about people. And so we were able to get, an actual degree, a degree plan put together. And then, as you know, Steve and I were able to walk the stage together. And that meant a lot to me, but it meant a lot more to Steve. And not only from what I did, from what you did, from what Dr. Palmer and Dr. Cawthon did, but what the university did, because this is his university, and it was very special. And we got on the news, that was fun, and got treated like a VIP going to graduation and all that. So yeah, and then the whole graduation ceremony was about Steve. Dr. Lim stands up there and he's talking about it's never too late. And I just thought, how cool, what a cool place to be. So that's kind of wraps that up in a nutshell.
Yeah, so from there, right, what does oral history mean to you, right?
Yeah, that was totally unexpected. And that, credit you again, check mark number, whatever, credit you again for that.
So you do this oral history of your father-in-law, and
yes,
the story where he ends up actually graduating with a degree.
Yes.
With you as you get your degree in history, which is what you wanted to do.
Yes.
You move on to grad school, right? And
yeah.
What does oral history mean in that whole process?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because the interview that I did with him in your class or for your class, I never really thought of it as being oral history for whatever reason. Maybe I didn't have an understanding of what oral history was. But then when you and I had talked about doing a internship at the Dallas Holocaust Museum, and my being the first UTA intern at the Dallas Holocaust Museum, and I was given the task of editing, how many hours? 31 hours of transcripts, something like that, 31 hours of interviews with a gentleman who was a German Jew, raised in Bavaria, escaped through different means as part of the kibbutz movement in Palestine. He ends up in Palestine as Hitler comes to power and as the persecution of the Jews is really beginning to take hold. He ends up in Palestine. He ends up joining the British Army, ultimately fights with the British Army in North Africa against Rommel. And he had been an artist. And his descriptions of life in Germany and life growing up in Bavaria, what it was like going to his grandmother's house and the heavy dark woods and the smells and the sounds of the streetcars in front of the house, and then later on the marching of the Nazis down the street, and just because he was an artist, he gave these vivid descriptions of his experience, and I was just enthralled by that. And so where those interviews had been kind of set aside for a period of time because there was just so much. The semester ended, and I think that Felicia at the Holocaust Museum probably expected me to say, okay, well, here's what I've done. And yet I continued to work on it until I finished it. And the reason why was because I had come to know this man. And not only him, but his family, because there's this son-in-law interviewing him, and then his daughter comes in every once in a while and asks questions, and the granddaughter comes in and asks him if he wants to, what he wants for lunch, and it was kind of this whole living out his experience through these interviews, and they weren't interviews on camera; they were just audio, and so I just started fell in love with oral histories, and then when I went to you, and you directed me to Dr. Saxon, who teaches obviously oral history and public history, and the day that I sat down and met with Dr. Saxon, he had gotten an email from somebody over at the library who had been auditing his oral history class. She gave me her books. And it was Yumi Ohira. And Yumi had emailed Dr. Saxon to ask him about someone who is interested in oral histories, who preferably has a military background, who is pursuing an advanced degree, on and on and on and on. And Dr. Saxon says, well, this may be serendipitous, but I just got this email from this person at the library, and this is what they're looking for. And I'm like, oh my gosh! I mean, can you write a closer job description? And so, unbeknownst to me, Dr. Palmer had been trying to kickstart Maverick Veterans Voices all over again since the time that he got here, because it had been on hiatus, if you will, for a period of time from 2013 to 2015. And many of our alumni veterans were kind of like, what's going on? We did this interview. Where is it? What happened? Well, it's available, but it's not accessible, and blah, blah, blah. Well, so I interviewed with Yumi, and it was during the COVID extended spring break, 2 weeks to flatten the curve, right? Well, so I interviewed on Teams with Yumi in March of or April of 2020, and I guess March of 2020, and Yumi hired me, and so I worked from home, working on organizing the transcripts, making sure the videos were clean. They had different things like sirens or announcements about petting dogs during the exams or what have you, and I had to get all that stuff, edited out. Well, ultimately, it came to the place where it was time to start doing my own interviews. So I spent literally the first 9 months just learning the process, going through the interviews that existed. There were 19 existing interviews. Going through those interviews, we were able to get all those cleaned up and get them, loaded up on the system. And so it was time to do new interviews. Well, I was not the greatest of fans with how the interviews had been videoed. I mean, they did a fine job. I'm not criticizing anybody who did the interviews previously, but the backdrop was gray, and it would have struck me as like a painter's drop cloth or something like that. And I just thought how dull, and you know, they're showing up on YouTube, and there's no branding, there's no, you know. So with Yumi's permission, I started coming up with ideas to get it, you know, to brand the interviews and to change the format a little bit. And then there became the issue of a place to interview. We're still in COVID, and by January, February 2021, we're still under COVID conditions. Nobody from off campus can come to the library, on and on. And so my first interview was with my father-in-law, was with Steve, as was my second and third, because I had developed this whole green screen thing, and you know, the picture on the side, and the logo, the Maverick Veterans Voices logo, and all that. And I knew that I was going to screw it up, so I decided to do Steve first because I knew he wouldn't pitch too much of a fit if I messed it up, which I did. And so I had to do it 3 times, but it turned out well. And the second one was Larry and Claudia Pink, who had just been inducted into the Military Science Hall of Honor, and we did that here at the library. Well, the library had this green screen room that faces an outside wall, and it was a Wednesday, and so we had the sirens going off, and we had people, construction workers out there jackhammering something or another. The wall right behind where we were, I think, is what it sounded like. And so I managed to get through it, but it took a lot. And the green screen room was not, or the green room was entirely green, and so the green reflections were everywhere. Point was that it was not the place to do it. And so I had to come up with another idea. And my idea was, I'm going to go buy my own stuff. I'm going to come up with a portable studio, and when it's required or necessary, I will go to people's homes. And so many of the interviews that we've done for Veterans Voices has been, you know, in people's homes where they're comfortable, and you know, with family members sitting by where they can talk. And I got people that wouldn't have come to campus in the first place because they live far away, you know, Oklahoma or down in San Antonio or what have you. So, you know, that's kind of how it grew from there. But it's all about the passion of doing oral histories, and although I can do them as audio, the video tells the story, because you get to see their eyes light up when they talk about happy times. You get to see them, kind of like me, you get to see them tear up when they talk about emotional times. And it draws you into their story even more. And so the investment that I made in improving the project was because of that. It wasn't because of, it was because of branding for the university, first of all, and secondly, because I wanted to have people, I wanted people to be able to see others telling their story.
So how many interviews? You said there were 19 when you started. How many have you done over the last 2 years?
I think we are going to, by the time I wrap up my engagement here, it will be 22.
22 new ones.
Yes, 22 new ones. Yeah, some wonderful, wonderful people. And I've made, that's the other thing about it, is I have made such wonderful friends through doing this because I care. Yeah. And it is just people I never would have met, the coolest people, you know, from people who never served, you know, they were in the ROTC or whatever and maybe never served, through, you know, General Latham or General Lester Simpson, Rex Latham, former CIA. Cool people, that I would have been just like, it took me a while to get over being fanboy, because it was just cool.
Well, I think that's part of it, right? And you've now vested yourself in some of these community organizations.
Yeah.
Right? Like the Rotary Club.
Yeah.
And was it the Cadet Corps Alumni Council?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so, what is, I'm trying to think how to put this, right? What's the future of MavVets Voices? What does it need to be?
That's a good question. And, I think it's up in the air to an extent. I think that, excuse me, out of necessity, it's going to take another oral historian who loves talking to people. And, whether it becomes ultimately a permanent oral history position, which I would like to see, whether I'm here or not. I would like to see that. I don't know if that's feasible or not, but it's going to have to be somebody with some credibility in the community, a veteran, or at least somebody who's studied military history and is aware of the veteran experience. But there's so many people that I've talked to that we haven't even gotten to yet. Out of 22 people, I could probably name 22 more. So the future of it, once I leave, I know that Yumi has plans to talk with you and Dr. Palmer about it, and Dr. Saxon, and see if we can nail this down. But it's going to have to be somebody with a passion for oral histories, and somebody who, I'm not patting myself on the back here when I say this, but somebody who can gain the trust of the people that we're interviewing. And I think, going back in time a little bit, my career in sales, my 20 years altogether in sales, prepared me to be an oral historian, because it prepared me to ask questions. It prepared me to engage. It prepared me to develop, relatively quick trust relationships. And so it's funny how you get from there to here, but that's it. But Veterans Voices will live on, because it's important to the history department. It's important to the university. It's important to the Cadet Corps alumni.
Well, I think it speaks to the tradition, the connection with the military and UTA in general, right?
Yes, it is a deep history, and if you go back and you look at some of the previous students, we have a Medal of Honor recipient. That's incredible. We have, as UTA alumni, we have astronauts. We have, obviously business leaders, community leaders, military leaders.
It's actor.
Who?
Lou Diamond Phillips, famous actor.
Oh, Lou Diamond Phillips. Yeah, look at the camera. Lou Diamond Phillips. Yeah. No, and yeah, but and famous actors like Lou Diamond Phillips, for instance, Tommy Franks. So it's important. It's important to remember the traditions of UTA, and that can all be lost in the other focuses, the Tier 1 research university, which I'm as proud of as anybody. But the history can get lost in that. The history can get lost in the engineering department, or the success of the engineering department, or the new social work building, or what have you. We have to keep the history alive.
And so I want to wrap up here, right? all this comes full circle to the. I want to ask you what the next step in your process,
Yeah,
right? Because you put all this together,
Yeah.
right? And where are you leaving Mavs Voices to go do? And how did you get there?
Well, so at I don't know how long ago that was, several months ago, as I'm wrapping up my master's degree, Yumi called me and said, Texas Tech is hiring an oral historian at the Vietnam Center, and I think you should apply. And then I called you, and you're like, oh yeah, well, I think that's a great idea. And I think, and so between you and Yumi and then Dr. Saxon and Brenda McClurkin, the archivist at the library, I was able to land that job. What is a dream job? I mean, it's like the Vietnam Center. This is what I do. And it was like the job description was written for me again, the second time around. I mean, you could call it serendipity, you could call it what you want, but I can pinpoint the beginning of the trajectory to where I am now, where I'm going in the future. The other wonderful thing was that I interviewed online one time with the folks at Texas Tech. They were wonderful people, and they hired me based on that one interview. And here's the guy, and that was it. And then they offered me the job, and as I began to talk to my family about it, it was like, it's going to break my heart, but it's not the time. And I called them and I said, you've offered me this wonderful opportunity, and unfortunately, it's not the right time. And maybe a day or two later, they called me back and said, well, what if we make it 100% remote for a year? Will that help you? And you could finish your master's degree. And it's like, wow. So oral historian, visiting assistant archivist, and oral historian at the Sam Johnson Vietnam Center and Archive. I mean, it's a dream. It really is.
So that seems like a very good ending point, but what else, is there anything you want to add that I didn't talk to you about, that I didn't ask you about, anything you want to ask yourself?
Okay. Anything that I would add? I think the most important thing is for anybody, and whether it's a student at UTA, a history student, somebody who aspires to be a historian or whatever, follow your dreams and try not to wait as long as I did. And I'm very fortunate to have a wife who loves me and who recognized that I needed a change, and really encouraged me to do that. And I think the other thing is search for mentors, find mentors. Don't get frustrated when they're not there right away, because if you show promise, if you show initiative, they'll come, they'll be there, and they'll lift you up like you. And I can't say enough good things about, I can't say enough good things about you and what you've done for me. And Dr. Saxon has been very important, obviously. Yumi has been a dream to work for. No better boss ever. Dr. Palmer and Dr. Palmer's support for the project and for me. Did I mention Gabe, by the way? Because on campus we didn't have a place to to do interviews because the library was in the process of building their new green screen room. And Gabe has worked with me not only giving me a place to do interviews on campus, which has been wonderful, but also adding his expertise, teaching me and helping me to kind of learn what to watch out for. And because I'm self-taught, and so there's a lot of things that I didn't know and a lot of things that I was making harder than they had to be. And so, you've got Gabe to thank for that too. There you go. You get throw a bone in there for you, Gabe. All right. So anyway.
Well, Joe, thanks for joining us here from Mavs Vet Voices. We really appreciate everything you've done for the program and for being one of the most special interviews we've done.
Thanks very, very much.